In July of this year, the United States suddenly announced a 35% tariff on all goods from Canada. Everyone expected Canada to protest to Washington. But surprisingly, Canada turned its guns around and announced a 25% tariff on Chinese steel. Perhaps they believed that by cooperating with the US to suppress China, they could gain some concessions. Embarrassingly, this very move prompted China to retaliate. Just a few days later, dozens of Canadian canola intermediaries received simultaneous contract termination notices, refusing to allow at least 3 million tons of canola to enter the Chinese market. China subsequently transferred this massive order, valued at $1.5 billion, to Australia. This was bad news for Canadian farmers, as the government's blind adherence to the new order left their warehouses filled with moldy canola seeds and cost tens of thousands of factory workers their jobs. So, after China canceled its orders, would Canada's canola seeds remain in warehouses to rot, or would they be exported to other countries? Could Australia completely replace Canada's canola orders? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now, let's get into today's topic. As one of the G7 nations, Canada's economy relies heavily on manufacturing, high-tech industries, and resource processing. This necessitates its high reliance on certain key resources in global trade, with steel being a prime example. In 2024, Canada's total steel imports totaled approximately 6.4 million tons, of which nearly half, 49%, or approximately 3.136 million tons, came from the United States. Thanks to the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, US steel imports not only account for a significant portion, but also enjoy zero tariffs. Of course, China, as one of the world's largest steel producers, also exports some steel to Canada, but the scale is relatively small at only approximately 640,000 tons annually. In terms of product types, China primarily exports mid to high-end steel products such as flat-rolled stainless steel and alloy steel, while Canadian steelmakers focus more on specific niche areas such as automotive steel. The two countries do have some complementary strengths in steel products, but this mutually beneficial situation did not last long. In July of this year, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney suddenly announced a 25% tariff on all steel products containing Chinese melted or cast components. If steel imports from certain non-free trade partner countries exceed half of the total for 2024, an additional 50% punitive tariff will be imposed. In short, their sole objective is to prevent all Chinese steel from entering Canada. Everyone is curious. Why are they suddenly imposing additional tariffs on Chinese steel? In fact, just days before the imposition of tariffs on Chinese steel, Canada faced a round of economic pressure from the United States. The U.S. announced a 35% tariff on Canadian imports in response to Canada's previous actions, including the removal of its digital services tax and the restart of trade negotiations with the U.S. The Canadian government chose not to publicly retaliate or protest this decision. Days later, Canada, citing the need to address overcapacity risks and maintain market stability, announced a 25% tariff on steel products containing Chinese components. However, based on the data I've checked, Chinese steel accounts for only about 18% of Canada's steel imports, far less than the US market share. Therefore, many people believe that Canada's move is more of a gesture of goodwill towards the US. After all, American steel accounts for nearly half of Canada's imports. So American steel imports will continue to enjoy zero tariff treatment and will not be subject to quota restrictions. However, Canada seems unconcerned about the consequences of these actions. Their sole goal is to persuade the US to remove tariffs on Canadian goods. To further curry favor with the US, Canada has again begun targeting Chinese companies. In July of this year, the Chinese security company Hikvision received an ultimatum. Canada ordered it to close all operations in Canada within 120 days, and its existing equipment was also forced to be removed. Hikvision has been operating in Canada for 12 years, including at the Vancouver Winter Olympics. Its equipment covers approximately 30% of the traffic surveillance network, and it has not experienced any security incidents to date. The expulsion order also caught local governments off guard, forcing the municipal system alone to spend 420 million Canadian dollars to replace inferior products. As a result, the Montreal Metro's misjudgment rate has soared by 40%. Perhaps many people are unaware of Canada's heavy dependence on the U.S. economy. Currently, U.S. capital controls at least 70% of Canada's energy sector and 50% of its manufacturing sector, leading Ottawa to tie 75% of its exports to the U.S. market. So when the Trump administration's tariff hike policy severely hit Canada's steel industry, Canada was forced to turn pressure to China in an attempt to exchange for concessions from the United States. However, so far, the United States has not adjusted its 35% tariff on Canada, and instead China has begun to retaliate against Canada. As we all know, Canada is one of the world's largest producers and exporters of canola, boasting a high oil yield of 44.6%, far exceeding that of other oilseed crops like soybeans and peanuts. Refined canola oil is widely used in cooking oils and is highly sought after in the international market. However, just days after Canada announced tariffs on Chinese steel, numerous Chinese companies terminated contracts with dozens of Canadian canola intermediaries, resulting in the rejection of at least 3 million tons of canola orders, valued at over $1.5 billion. Canada is highly dependent on canola exports to China, with the Chinese market accounting for at least 1/3 of its total exports and meeting approximately 40% of China's domestic canola demand. In 2024, Canada exported approximately 6.126 million tons of canola to China, valued at over $3 billion, accounting for 95.8% of its global exports. Thanks to China's long-term, large-scale purchases, Canadian farmers have benefited significantly annually. It is projected that Canada's canola exports to China will grow to 7 million tons by 2025. Since Canada's canola export channels to China were cut off, Western ports have been overwhelmed with canola, with at least 1,800 containers stranded and unable to be shipped, leaving many farmers and exporters in dire straits. On farms in Saskatchewan, warehouses are overflowing with tons of unsold canola, and rusted harvesters sit silently beside the fields. Farmers, watching the 12% plunge in futures prices on their phones, shake their heads in frustration. This is the consequence of Canada blindly following U.S. policy toward China, while ordinary farmers are bearing the brunt of the losses. However, if China stops importing canola from Canada, how will it fill this massive supply gap? In fact, after Canada, Australia, Russia, and Mongolia are the world's second largest canola exporters. However, due to unfavorable weather conditions and reduced planted area, Australia's canola production later this year is expected to be only about 5.7 million tons, the lowest level in nearly 5 years. Despite this, Australia still plans to export approximately 4 million tons of canola. But since 2020, Australian rapeseed products have been blocked from the Chinese market, mainly because their products failed to fully meet China's import standards. But now, the years-long rapeseed trade freeze is about to end. Shortly after Canada announced a 25% tariff on Chinese steel, Australia actively sought to expand economic and trade cooperation with China. In July of this year, Prime Minister Albanese made an emergency visit to China and held business negotiations with China on canola trade. Prior to this, the two sides have been discussing plant quarantine requirements related to the spread of blackleg disease, with the goal of resuming canola imports from Australia. Almost simultaneously, China announced a 4-year canola import agreement with Australia for a total of 3 million tons. Under this cooperation framework, Australia will ship 150,000 to 250,000 tons of canola to China in 5 trial batches. If the trial shipments go smoothly, Subsequent orders are expected to reach an annual average export volume of 3 to 4 million tons, nearly equivalent to Canada's total canola exports to China. Furthermore, Australia has a natural advantage in canola exports to China in terms of geographical location and transportation conditions. Its main canola-producing areas are concentrated in Western Australia and South Australia, which are relatively close to China. By sea, canola from these regions to China takes only approximately 7 to 10 days. In contrast, Canada, which used to be China's main source of rapeseed imports, usually has a shipping time of more than 30 days. Of course, as a long-term partner of China, Russia also possesses considerable competitiveness in the rapeseed sector. 10 years ago, Russia's annual rapeseed production was less than 500,000 tons. By 2021, this figure had risen to 2.8 million tons. By early November last year, Russia's rapeseed harvest had reached 4.2 million tons, a 55.5% increase over the same period the previous year, setting a record high. China is Russia's largest rapeseed export market, importing 1.1 million tons, a 2.9-fold year-on-year increase. However, overall, Russia still has significant untapped potential in grain and oilseed exports to China. This year, rapeseed production in Siberia is expected to reach 5 million tons, a significant increase from 4.2 million tons last year. In order to further promote grain trade with China, Russia also announced a new plan at the end of April this year to build a grain export transit station near the Zabaykalsk railway port on the Sino-Russian border, specifically for exporting agricultural products such as soybeans, rapeseed, wheat, oats, corn, sunflower seeds, and barley to China. The total investment is expected to reach 6.3 billion rubles. It's clear that even if China doesn't import Canadian canola, many countries are still willing to cooperate with China. After all, China's massive population represents a vast consumer market, a demand large enough for many countries to benefit from. However, Canada's political position has long been sensitive. As mentioned earlier, American capital controls approximately 70% of Canada's energy industry and 50% of its manufacturing sector, leading some to jokingly call Canada the 51st state of the United States. Whenever friction arises between China and the United States, Canada often sides with the United States, even at the expense of its own economic interests, in exchange for concession from the United States in certain areas. To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.